So, you find yourself on the UnrealEntGaming channel. How fortunate for you. I, Lord Frieza, will spare your life as long as you subscribe and turn on notifications. Also, don't forget to become a member of UnrealEntGaming's Patreon for tons of exclusive content to early access media and much more. Do it now, or else.
With our heroes now having to continue their journey throughout the Demon Realm and having to reach Goma's castle, we now finally get an unexpected encounter between our heroes and a very sinister Namekian that goes by the name of Nebba, as I here now want to welcome you all to my Dragon Ball Daima anime episode number 11 review. And right off the gate from the very beginning, this was a very surprising episode to say the least, from start to finish. And from the very beginning of the episode itself is when we get to see how things are beginning to take a very interesting turn, with of course our heroes having to confront and meet Nebba for the first time, which not only did Nebba himself in this episode take interest in learning of the fact of Goku and company having to defeat Tamagami number 3 and gain access to one of the Dragon Balls, but what I specifically liked about this overall episode, especially during the beginning, was seeing Nebba's overall demeanor upon having to see the Dragon Ball within their possession, because that only goes as far as to establish more of a sinister aura around Nebba, which I personally like, because thus far in the Dragon Ball series, with maybe the exception of a few characters like Lord Slug and of course Demon King Piccolo from days old, we really don't come across evil Namekians all too often, of course not counting the Universe 6 Namekians from Dragon Ball Super. So to see Nebba actually go as far as to take interest in our heroes, on top of the fact of also being shown speaking to Piccolo face to face, despite the fact of Piccolo even having to go as far as to stand his ground, which I really enjoyed in having to see their conversation, after further having to introduce himself to Nebba by giving him his name, Nebba really didn't know who Piccolo was, which not for nothing I really like, because you don't really have to have Nebba kind of know about every single Namekian in this case, right? And especially with Piccolo bar none being the most powerful Namekian among them all, even at this very point in time, to see how our heroes were completely oblivious to the overall sinister nature to that of Nebba only raises that much more tension within their group, which I personally like. But even then, despite with the fact of Goma having to be shown watching, Degasu having to be shown watching, within the very same episode as our heroes went as far as to make their way in confronting Tamagami number 2, we only then pan on over to Dr. Arinsu and the demon witch known as Marbara, as they were going as far as to create, yes, another Majin warrior, which surprise surprise, based on the overall leaks we knew was going to happen. And it was only during this entire ordeal was where once again we saw how they were mixing things into this cauldron, which I like the whole cauldron idea of having to create these warriors with, but if you were expecting something out of the ordinary, you were not going to get that whatsoever, because in this episode we had the birth, we had the debut of Majin DUU. And if I'm gonna be flat out honest with his overall design, not his demeanor, because his demeanor is very different to that of Majin Ku, I'm just gonna call a spade here and say that I am not a fan of the overall design of Majin Ku and Majin DUU, which again, mind you, Dragon Ball Daima is not immune to criticism. Criticism is warranted when needed, and sometimes it is a good thing. And so just because you may criticize something doesn't mean that you have a disdain for something just because you want to point something out, to which I'm doing right now by saying that the overall design behind Majin DUU is very silly, it's very lackluster. But I know what a lot of people are gonna say, they're not the final villains. Who knows, they might end up merging together and creating some, I don't know, Super Buu-esque type warrior where he looks menacing and very imposing, which I think that would be something that Toriyama would do, is creating two goofy looking characters only to put them together and creating one really menacing one. But even with that concept idea aside, when Majin DUU came into fruition and he immediately began to talk and he began to walk, the first thing that he wanted to do was eat, which is kind of funny because, I mean, well, he's fat, right? So I think that it's typical of Toriyama to go as far as to do this, and even went as far as to kind of munch down on Majin Ku's hand a bit, which I will also say that Majin Ku looked relatively happy that he was going to have somewhat of maybe a companion companion or a sibling to that extent, you know? Which I kind of go as far as to pity these two, because I really don't see them surviving by the end of Dragon Ball Daima series, of course, especially if and only if these two end up proving to be the quote final villains of the series. To see the way Majin Buu came into fruition, I knew this was going to happen. A lot of us already knew, especially even when going back when Ku had basically retreated by telling Dr. Arinsu, hey, I give up against Tamagami number 1, let's go. We kind of already knew that something like this was going to happen, so I really didn't go as far as to take issue by seeing another newly created Majin having to join the fray. But even then, surprisingly enough, within the same episode, which was something that I really wasn't expecting, especially after seeing the creation of Majin Buu, was where once again Dr. Arinsu was then shown having to show up in front of Tamagami number 1 yet again with Majin Ku, only this time alongside with Majin Buu, only for Majin Buu now to be the one to directly challenge Tamagami 1, which from the very beginning I really didn't expect much, because I thought that Tamagami 1 was going to completely clear. But surprise, surprise, Majin Buu was actually doing a lot better than Majin Ku, which really took me back, because I wasn't expecting for Majin Buu to actually be able to not only avoid and avert all danger against Tamagami 1, but he was actually at the same time also shown getting a few clean hits in, which mind you, Majin Ku wasn't able to do previously. So this only goes on to further put into perspective that in fact Majin Buu just might be more powerful than Majin Ku, which I don't really have an issue with, because it would only appear as though Majin Buu is the one that kind of is a bit more lax and serious than Majin Ku is, but at the same time, there really isn't anything that much different to him by comparison to his appearance. But even right after, as Majin Buu was actually able to be shown having to hold his own, even Tamagami number 1 was relatively surprised, and it looked as though in the beginning they were kind of fighting to a stalemate, to which we even went as far as to see Majin Buu put his cheeks and his entire crotch within Tamagami number 1's face. So it's not like, when you put into perspective, if Majin Buu kind of fights similar to that of Majin Buu, because if you were to compare the two, I would say, at least personally, that it would only appear as though Majin Buu is a bit more on the goofier side of things, give or take, even though throughout the entire time of him having to fight Tamagami number 1, it wasn't as though he was making faces or he wasn't doing anything of the sorts that indicated that he was kind of goofing around. He actually took Tamagami number 1 serious then, but at the same time, as we then later on get to see how our heroes had confronted Tamagami number 2, it was now finally Vegeta's turn to get in on the action against Tamagami number 2, and that fight in and of itself was also a very, very awesome fight to see, because not only does it kind of go as far as to show us as to how strong these Tamagami actually are, which I've been wanting to see since the inception of this show, in terms of having to see suitable or at least formidable enemies and or oppositions to our heroes, which we haven't really gotten throughout this entire time until now. But even while Vegeta went as far as to fight Tamagami number 2 in base, it looked as though Vegeta was doing relatively okay until Tamagami number 2, which mind you, he bears that of the Trident, had managed to completely turn things around on Vegeta, until a little later on, surprisingly enough, during the actual fight between them, was where Vegeta was shown plummeting down into the ocean, only to be shown getting eaten by the exact same Kraken that they went as far as to fight before, which was also surprising to me, because everyone else seemed as though they were absolutely shocked that this was going to be the end of Vegeta, which we know that it isn't. But even now, I'm only going to be kind of curious on whether or not Vegeta is going to be able to bust out of the Kraken by using Super Saiyan, perhaps maybe Super Saiyan 3. Now I know what you might be saying, I know what you might be thinking, but the entire thing about Super Saiyan 3 Vegeta in Daima is apparently true, so I'm going to go as far as to tell you now, don't be surprised if something of the sorts actually ends up becoming a thing, because even myself, I am very skeptical on seeing this. But apparently enough, according to the leakers, this is going to be an actual thing, or somewhat of a, I guess you could say, variant of what Super Saiyan 3 would look like at some given point throughout the entirety of this series before it nears its end. So I'm only going to assume that perhaps maybe Vegeta is going to go as far as to do this. If not, he will remain in Super Saiyan, perhaps maybe Super Saiyan 2. But I think that all in all, we can agree that Vegeta is going to inevitably defeat Tamagami number 2, which I really don't take issue with, especially after seeing how Majin Buu had fought Tamagami number 1 to a stalemate going into next week's episode. So I'm only going to assume that with Tamagami number 3 having to relinquish the Dragon Ball to Goku after giving up, and with Tamagami 2 assumingly having to lose next week, one can only go as far as to imagine as to what they're going to have lined up for us going into these battles, because not only did this episode kind of leave us off on 2 cliffhanger fights that really weren't resolved to begin with. This only to me continues to build that much more suspense, which I think is desperately needed for this show. But on top of the fact is that with Nebba also shown having to dwell among our heroes in cloaking his sinisterness, while of course Degasu and Goma are watching, this only now begins to beg the question on whether or not we're going to see Nebba turn on our heroes, or something of the sorts ends up happening, to which after Vegeta ends up defeating Tamagami number 2, perhaps Nebba is going to want the second Dragon Ball alongside the previous Dragon Ball gathered by Tamagami number 3. So I'm only going to expect some kind of betrayal, which I cannot wait to see go down during next week's episode, which I'm really excited to see. But even now, by the very end of all of this, I want to go ahead and get your thoughts and opinions down in the comment section below, not only in regards as to what you guys thought about Dragon Ball Daima anime episode number 11, but what I also want to know is your investment levels into Dragon Ball Daima now that we're 11 episodes in, because I can understand, because I was one of them early on when Daima kind of started off a bit slow, where it was a little difficult to fully get into and really catch yourself being immersed within it. But I think that as Dragon Ball Daima continued to go on, then not only did I find myself having to invest more into the show, especially after having to personally find out that Glorio really isn't who he says to Goku that he is, right? Which I can't remember which episode it was where we found out that he was speaking to Dr. Arinsu this entire time, but that was the moment, I think, for me that really went on to pull me into the show, that made me that much more invested within Daima. And with everything that we're seeing now, I cannot wait to see as to how this is all going to come to an end, especially once everything culminates in seeing the final fight of the series and seeing how everything is going to more or less move into Dragon Ball Super by the very end of its series. So once again, I want to go ahead and get your thoughts down below, as I want to thank you all so much for watching. As always, thank you all so much for your time, to which once again, if you also just so happen to be new to the channel and of course love Dragon Ball, then I do encourage for you all to head on over and smash that subscribe button, on top of making sure to give this video a big fat thumbs up by smashing that like button down below. Tune back in for more. Thank you all so much for being here. As always, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays coming up, as we are going to be continuing with Daima going into next week's episode. But before we get into Dragon Ball Daima anime episode number 12, I do want to wish you all, from me to you, a very happy holiday season. I hope you guys have a wonderful and a blessed holiday season at that. So with that being said, thank you all once more, and I'll be seeing each and every single one of you down in the comment section below and in the next video. Take it easy, guys, and have a great day. Peace.
Hello. Did you know that you can stay up to date with the latest Dragon Ball content by simply subscribing to UnrealEntGaming?
Also, don't forget to follow on these social media platforms, you sexy son of a bitch.
Roshi.
Silent Cell, me and the fans are having a moment. That's right. I know what you want. Extra long, thick Dragon Ball content. Quality reviews with flawless editing. Yeah, you'd like that, wouldn't you? You dirty bitch.
Roshi, the fuck?
God damn it, I need them to subscribe, Cell.
And we're demonetized.
Yeah, screw it. Let's cut to the video.